The first paper we're going to hear is by Rosie Macqueen, titled Us and Them, the English-Formed Identity in Colonial India.
I'd like to preface that this presentation was adapted from a 30-page pro seminar, and that means a lot of content had to get cut for the sake of timing, so I will be speeding through things fairly quickly. I'll be more than happy to answer more questions about details and stuff during the Q&A, or you can hunt me down during lunch or whatever. But because there's going to be so many events and dates and things being brought up, I've added this timeline, which should hopefully help keep things straight for you guys. So with all that said, let's get the show started. Racism is nothing new in this world. For as long as groups of people have interacted with each other, they have made assumptions, oppressed one another, and used the flaws of another race to emphasize the glory of their own. The case is no different for England, once at the head of the greatest empire in history, built on the backs of non-English peoples, be they Irish, Algonquin, or Zulu. We'll be looking at the case of England and India, and how the English kept themselves in the moral right while oppressing the Indians. In their attempts to glorify their own race and justify ruling over India, English imperialists twisted facts and observations into proof of the barbarism of Indian peoples, contradicting themselves repeatedly to counter the flood of evidence proving that the peoples of India were not inferior to Europeans. Dating back to the 17th century, England had established itself as an educated, Christian, gentlemanly nation, bestowed with modernism and the gift of civilization, passed down from the Roman Empire. Into the 18th and 19th centuries, English imperialists used this overly positive self-image to justify colonizing and conquering non-European peoples across the globe, relying on the concept of the civilizing mission. Is that good enough? I don't know. Relying on the concept of the civilizing mission to keep themselves in the moral high ground. The civilizing mission was a concept adopted by most Western empires around the same time, the general idea being that non-white peoples were suffering in their own barbarism and didn't even realize it, and it was the duty of modern Western empires to swoop in and save the natives with proper civilization, eradicating the native culture in the process. Force was deemed acceptable where necessary, and countless colonized peoples were killed, trying to resist being forced to civilize, or even just so the empire could make an example out of them. It should be noted that some imperialists did truly believe in the civilizing mission and advocated for the humane treatment of colonized peoples. Some even planned to eventually decolonize peacefully once natives had been taught how to govern themselves. However, the civilizing mission was also a propaganda tool used to justify massacres and cultural erasure in the name of bettering the lives of natives. With this mentality, the English delved into India, the East India Company setting up a base in the subcontinent in 1612. The company expanded during the 1700s with its private army, becoming the de facto government of India, and the Raj took over in 1858, officially bringing India under Crown rule. During the 19th century, anthropology was beginning to develop as a serious science, albeit more focused on the strange and exotic aspects of foreign cultures, rather than the unbiased observation modern anthropologists strive for. One branch of anthropology was called Orientalism, focused on the peoples of Asia. British Orientalists picked apart every aspect of Indian culture available, searching for reasons to justify colonizing the subcontinent. India's major religion, Hinduism, was one of these aspects. Unlike most Westerners assume, Hinduism is not a polytheistic religion. Rather, there is one god, Brahman, which encompasses every aspect of life, death, and beyond. Because Brahman is inherently abstract, it is personified into multiple deities, each representing different aspects of Brahman, which is where the idea of multiple gods, such as Vishnu, Ganesh, and so on, come from. Rather than attempting to understand the concept of Brahman and its incarnations, English Orientalists instead classified Hinduism as polytheistic, forcing it into a Western worldview. Under this assumption, Hinduism was compared to the pantheons of ancient Greece and Rome, which was very high praise for the time. Ancient Greece and Rome were considered the absolute height of civilization in 19th century Europe, and claiming Hinduism had a connection to these classical cultures implied that it held some part of the glorious Greco-Roman legacy. At the same time, however, British Orientalists condemned and criticized Hinduism, theorizing that the vast number of deities had made Hindus scattered and chaotic, not knowing how they should worship, whereas the Christian church was organized and had a central canon. The multiple deities also supposedly made Hindus unworthy, as they worshipped multiple figures and did not know how to be loyal to just one. By that logic, they couldn't be loyal to anyone and were seen as perpetually suspicious and two-faced by imperialists. Here is one major contradiction. Hinduism is put on par with ancient Greco-Roman religion due to having multiple deities, but is also condemned for the same reason. Another case in which the English failed to adjust to India was with the legal system. Generally speaking, signatures were not strictly binding in India, and property cases could be renegotiated after a verdict had been made. By comparison, the English system was much stricter, and when English imperialists were confronted with Indians trying to adjust or renegotiate land issues, they perceived it as Indians going back on their word or trying to weasel out of a bad bargain. This stereotype of untrustworthiness was so deeply ingrained that when the East India Company came under scrutiny for official corruption in the 1810s, rather than fix the company, English officials passed all the blame onto the few Indian officials the company had, making little effort to fix the problem themselves. This is an example of how the English would make excuses to justify their rule. Certainly, some Indian officials had shady business practices, but to place blame solely on them without considering the practices of British officials who outnumbered the Indians by far is unrealistic at best. India's very history became a tool for Orientalists to pick apart. Imperialists found plenty of positives in India's history, admiring the architecture, literature, and philosophy. Orientalists proposed a so-called Golden Age of Hinduism, characterizing it as an egalitarian society of wealth and cultural prosperity, making India out to be a rich, desirable colony. A common theory at the time was that Europeans, especially Western Europeans, were descended from a group called the Aryans, a real people who lived in South Central Asia, but whose culture and history have since been appropriated for racist purposes. Though technically true, since modern science now proves that all humans are descended from a common ancestor people, early anthropologists believed that different cultures stemmed from completely different sources. Therefore, Europeans had no relation to indigenous Americans, the peoples of Africa, or most other non-European cultures. They also believed that it was because they were direct descendants of the Aryans that European society had evolved into modernity, while other cultures hadn't. Aryans were seen as being naturally predisposed towards civilization, a trait other cultures lacked. Orientalists studying India proposed that Hindus too were descendants of the Aryans, to explain how they were capable of great architecture and literature in the past. This also created a link between India and Western Europe, giving England an excuse to justify being involved in the subcontinent. Now, with all this praise for the past, the question becomes, how could England possibly characterize Indians as barbarians if India had been civilized centuries ago? For that, Orientalists turned to an easy scapegoat, the Muslims. Arriving in the Indian subcontinent in the 1500s, the Muslim Mughal Empire had colonized parts of northern India, ruling up until the East India Company took over. Mughal rule was by no means perfect. The empires had been getting weaker each generation. Emperors, not empires, pardon me, and princes and warlords had been steadily chipping away at land and power. But Islam was a well-established religion in India by the time the English invaded, and aside from territorial skirmishes, lived relatively peacefully with the Hindus to the south. However, the presence of Muslims proved to be a boon to imperialists, who blamed the arrival of Islam for the supposed downfall of Hindu society. This is another case of imperialists creating logic loop to justify ruling India. The Hindu Golden Age made India desirable, something worth colonizing, yet India had to be a poor, barbarous society in order for England to stay in the moral high ground while conquering it. Thus, Islam was blamed for the decline of Hinduism. The stereotype of the violent and bloodthirsty Muslim dated all the way back to the Crusades, and British imperialists found it easy to characterize the Mughal takeover as an absolutely brutal oppression of the Hindus, pointing to ancient art and architecture as proof. This was a time when art had precise, strict rules in Europe, with laws of aesthetics that established what was and was not beautiful. Characteristics found in European art were considered more beautiful, while features of foreign art, especially from the colonies, were less beautiful. Using the science of aesthetics, Orientalists dissected pre- and post-Mughal art, using the differences between the two as evidence that the presence of Islam had ruined Hinduism. Under that assumption, England now had yet another excuse to rule India, to restore it to its pre-Mughal glory days. However, that would prove to be impossible to achieve, given the racist views the English held of Indians. Not all Indians resisted English rule. Many, in fact, embraced it, converting to Christianity, learning English, and if they could afford it, traveling to Europe for school. Often called the New Intellectual Class, oh my goodness. These individuals saw opportunities in the East India Company and Raj governments, aspiring to work within the bureaucracy to give Indians more rights and autonomy. However, the actual opportunities for English-educated Indians were few and far between. As mentioned, the number of British civil servants far outweighed the number of Indians, and the few Indians who did get work were met with suspicion and distrust. Here is yet another contradiction. The British pushed aggressively for Indians to anglicize themselves, yet anglicized Indians were given very few chances to use their English educations. This also completely undermined the purpose of the civilizing mission, not allowing Indians to make themselves civilized by refusing to let them govern themselves. Much of the new intellectual class was unemployed, effectively blocked off from any civil positions, and they were well aware of it. Near the end of the 19th century, the new intellectuals would coalesce into the first Indian nationalist movement, advocating first for autonomy and then independence. A more specific case of the failure of the civilizing mission and the contradictory nature of British views of India was the Ilbert Bill crisis, in 1883. This happened only 25 years after the Ilbert Bill crisis in 1883, only 25 years after the Indian Mutiny. The mutiny was focused in northern and central India, where Indian soldiers in the East India Company's private army revolted, joined by peasants and merchants. It was horrifically brutal, and the counter-revolt from Britain was even worse, with soldiers and civilians slaughtered en masse on both sides. The mutiny was short, lasting only a few months between 1857 and 1858, with some small-scale skirmishes into 1859, but it remained in the memories of many English officials. The Raj government, instated in 1858 to overtake the East India Company, initially responded to the mutiny with much harsher and more forceful rule, but the arrival of George Robinson, also known as Viceroy Lord Ripon, in 1880 shifted that. As leader of India, Robinson was a true believer in the civilizing mission. He felt it was his duty to give Indians the chance to prove themselves as civilized people and to prepare them to govern themselves. In 1883, civil servant Courtenay Ilbert proposed a bill that would allow a small number of anglicized Indians to reside over judicial cases involving Englishmen. The number of Indians this would affect was very small, as they would need to be extremely experienced in law, and it is estimated that only a dozen Indian men in the entire colony would have been allowed to become judges. Still, Robinson pushed the bill forward, seeing it as a small but symbolically significant step towards fulfilling the civilizing mission. The backlash was sudden and shocking. Newspapers in Britain printed hyperbolic articles, one warning about cruel Indian judges locking up innocent Englishmen and stealing their wives and property. You think I'm joking, I'm not. English papers in India picked up on the articles and, without fact-checking, relayed the misinformation, sending English people living in India into a panic. On February 5th, only 2 days after the bill was proposed, the London Times wrote, quote, "However skilled a lawyer or pure a judge a native may be, it is obviously absurd to say that he is as competent as an Englishman to form a correct opinion concerning an Englishman's conduct." This quote reveals the ultimate failings of the idea of the civilizing mission. All the assumptions about India, the chaotic religion, the untrustworthy people, the decaying society, all the factors that had been used to justify the necessity of the civilizing mission were so deeply ingrained in the English imperial mentality that imperialists could not conceive of a civilized Indian. No matter how educated, no matter how westernized, an Indian would always be beneath an Englishman. The racist society of colonial India could not uphold itself, and it was inevitable that the Raj and the empire as a whole would collapse. The new intellectuals used the very same political and national rhetoric they had learned in British schools to argue for national self-determination, and the popular appeal of Mahatma Gandhi gave the masses a venue to express their grievances. The calling out of Britain's self-contradiction, coupled with changing attitudes towards imperialism and race relations following World War II, weakened the empire's legitimacy in India and was one of the many factors that caused Imperial Britain to dissolve. It was not a perfect end. Tensions between Indian Hindus and Muslims led to the messy partition of Pakistan, followed soon after by Gandhi's assassination, and all the internal troubles of a newly established nation. But in the fight for independence, India had proved itself capable of reaching Western standards of civilization, and in doing so, had knocked down every falsified reason Britain had to rule over it. Thank you.
Thank you. Moving on, we're turning now to Katie MacDonald, whose paper is The Emperors of Mexico, The Empire Strikes Out.
I wish it was back on a 30-page paper. Now, a couple things. I want to go a little bit over a little bit of background. Now, I grew up, I was in the military, and I worked with a lot of crusty master chiefs and crusty captains. They always told me the KISS principle, which was keep it simple, stupid. So I don't have any presentations like this. So whenever I'm talking about somebody over here, I want you to imagine the bright blue uniform, the tan pants, lots of medals, ribbons, sashes, hats with feathers on them, and big giant epaulets on the shoulders with the gold braids down on them, okay? So imagine that. Now, I prefer imagining the mayor of Munchkinville. It makes it a little easier for me. So, a little bit of background on it is that when Spain colonized what is now known as Latin America, they kind of divided up the people there. You had the Spanish, you had the in the case of Mexico, the Mexican-born Spanish. Then you had the Mestizo, which was the mixed indigenous and Spanish. And then you had the elite indigenous, and then you had the peasant indigenous. Now, depending on which group you were a part of, was where you put the standards of where the people were at. Another part of how this came about, how did the Mexican Revolution ever even begin, is because in 1807, the Peninsular War in Europe began. That was when Spain and France invaded Portugal. The Portuguese government, the king, actually fled to Brazil, which was one of their colonies. This gave England, Britain, the chance to attack France. So now they're all worried about each other. They're all worried about all their own lands being taken over by the most powerful governments on the planet, the superpowers of that time. So that kind of took all the colonies and let them kind of do their own thing. But then all the other colonies started, or all the other great powers started manipulating the colonies against each other, manipulating, around that way. Now, during that time, after that is that Miguel Hidalgo y Castilla, who was a Catholic priest in Mexico. And he was kind of an outlier of the priesthood because he rejected celibacy and he loved to gamble. So with Spain preoccupied, Hidalgo raised an army of peasants and conquered town after town on his way to Mexico City, leaving a wake of blood and destruction. His cause was for the redistribution of land away from the Spanish elites. All the wealthy people there had too much wealth. He wanted to redistribute that land to all the peasants. So obviously that was not good if you're like one of the elites who owns all this land. So, made aware of the revolution around him, Agustin Cosme Damian de Iturbide y Aramburu, long Spanish name, I love him, I cannot pronounce him, so we're going to call him Augustine from now on. And he was 27 years old at that time, and he was a lieutenant of the Mexican Provincial Army and the son of a very wealthy landowner. He was originally trained out of the provincial Army since he was 15 years old, and he retired at 25 years old because of some sort of an illness. I wish it was like that now. Retired at 25. He had heard that the intendant of the Valladolid province and his town was captured by the rebel forces, Hidalgo's forces, and he desired fervently that he had to go do something about this. He could not let this stand. So what he did is, out of his own money, or his father's money, however you want to look at it, he hired a militia and looked for volunteers to go march on the town and free the town from these rebel forces. Now we're getting back over to like Star Wars. But when he got there, he was vastly outgunned, vastly outmanned. So half his people ran away. He was not deterred. He said, no, we could do this, we could do this. So he attacked the town anyways. When he attacked the town, the peasants that were in the rebel uprising gathered more people. So now he's running, and he ran all the way back as far as he can go and get away from these rebel forces. Well, all the other generals, they all said, he's not a very good guy here. So what he basically did is he says, no, I'm a hero. I may have lost, but I deserve valor. I deserve this. And they said, okay, shut up. You got it. So they considered him a hero, somebody that was willing to fight for the king, or for the king of Spain. It was the royalist forces. What ended up happening, though, is that the peasants started winning. So just like any good person does, you switch sides. You say, oh, this might not be too bad. And what happens, they wrote up what's called the Plan of Iguala. The Plan of Iguala was really kind of nice because what it did is it recognized all the different factions that were within Mexico and said that we're going to integrate these into a constitutional monarchy. That means that we will absolutely have equal rights. So that answered that. No, okay, everybody's going to be equal. It also recognized that the one church is going to be the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church was very important during that time because that was the one institution that no matter which group that you belonged to the Catholic Church. It was the one tie that tied them all together. So it was a very integral part of the Mexican Revolution. Now, once all the people signed this plan, they had to hire a regency. They voted for a regency, a president, which ended up being Augustine. Nice and convenient for him. So nobody there actually had any experience at all of how to form a government, so he kind of took it upon himself to write that government. And while he was writing that, he kind of diminished the power that this Congress was going to have and give more power to the president and eventually to the monarch, to the emperor. Now, when they found out about this, the locals, the people that were a part of this plan, were like, I don't quite agree with this. You're gathering a little bit too much power on there, and they decided that we're going to write a stern letter. It was either that or assassination. Stern letter. We'll go with that one. And the first thing that he did is he said, okay, he actually arrested all of them because they were conspiring against this government. And it was actually a very light prison sentence, kind of let them all go except for about 2 or 3, and he exiled them. Well, at that point, the people were extraordinarily pleased with him. They loved him. They thought he was great. They're chanting outside, long live Augustine, long live Augustine. And Augustine, being a little bit of a drama queen, turns around to his general and says, oh my goodness, they love me. What should I do? What should I do? And the general says, maybe you should be the emperor. Oh, no, not me. Yeah, okay. So they started the voting process to vote him in as the emperor. One problem being is they didn't have enough people for a quorum to actually do this. But they did it anyways. So now he is the emperor. Long live Augustine. Go to the next page. I'm sorry if I'm a little distracted here. But one thing that Augustine never did is he never started a reign of terror. The only people that really despised them were the Spain Spanish, because he kind of took away their authority, took away their power. During that time, a lot of people came out of the woodwork to congratulate him. And one of them was Colonel Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. That Santa Anna. Santa Anna of the Alamo. At that time, he was 27 years old. And when he met the new emperor, he says, I have met your sister, and she is the most beautiful, gorgeous woman I've ever seen in my life. And, we all could look and say, oh, you know what? Yeah, that's the emperor's sister. Yeah, we know what that's all about. She was also 63 years old. So Emperor Augustine says, yeah, right, you're in love with my sister. Yeah, okay, right. But he was impressed with his zeal and his willingness to put his life on the line for the Mexican government. So what he did is he made him, he was like the commander of a province. Well, the province didn't like him. They thought he was arrogant, and we're talking about Santa Anna was an arrogant person, very sexually promiscuous, let's say. kind of a despot, but he was put in charge anyways. So right now we don't know, nobody's ever really said, was Santa Anna really in love with Augustine's sister or not? Nobody is really quite sure on that, but as soon as he was in that power, he immediately started all sorts of plots against Augustine. He actually started a rebellion against Augustine. So now Augustine has to respond to this. Now this Congress that he had originally fired and hired new people got word of this, and in the process, 5 minutes, good Lord. And in this process, he went ahead and joined with, these two forces joined against Augustine. Well, now Augustine's like, oh, all right, okay, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to write a new constitution, and I'm going to rehire Congress, okay? And they said, no, that's not good enough. You already betrayed us once. We're not going through this mess again. So basically what happened was that Augustine said, okay, I'll go ahead and abdicate. And he says, no, you're not abdicating either, because if you abdicate, that means that you are actually an emperor. You never were. You're not legitimate. So Augustine went ahead and he left. He just left the country. He went into exile, and a new government came in. Well, Mexican politics being what Mexican politics is sometimes, it was rife with corruption for years and years and years. Santa Anna was the president and the vice presidents about 4 or 5 times each, going back and forth during this time. Finally, Benito Juarez, who was a liberal at the time, was the president of Mexico, started borrowing money from Spain, France, and Britain. And in order to gain funds for the new government, to pay off people to keep them from rebelling. And he basically told all 3 of those countries, I'm not paying you back either. Finally, France, Spain, and England, this is 1861, decided they were going to do something about it. We're going to get our money back. At that time was the start of the American Civil War, and the Monroe Doctrine, which was written to specifically prevent any colonial power from going back into Latin America, kind of was put on hold because they couldn't do anything as long as there was a civil war going on. So when they arrived in Mexico on the coast, they decided at that point that they were going to demand their money back. The money, as Juarez went, okay, I guess we'll pay you back since you could probably defeat us in a war fairly easily. He agreed to pay them back. Britain left, France stayed. Within a couple of days, they started marching in on Mexico City. In Pueblo, Mexico, they were defeated by Mexican forces. Cinco de Mayo. Now you know where that comes from. Upon arriving, Juarez agreed to have an emperor. The emperor himself was the brother of the king of Austria. He didn't want to become a king or the emperor unless it was by all the people. Everybody had to agree to it. So with a wink and a nod, you know, Napoleon III of France said, yeah, they all want you there. Here's the letter signed by all the people there that he paid off. So he arrived. The church thought, because of all the liberal things that happened, the redistribution of churches' lands, that he was going to give back all the properties of the Catholic Church. He didn't. Maximilian, at that point, he did everything he could to make life better. But the one thing he did wrong is all the followers of Juarez, he declared outlaws, and that he was going to hunt them down. Viva la revolución. We got another revolution. Eventually, he lost, and he lost big, because the big thing that happened that caused him to lose is the Civil War ended. All of the French troops that were backing him up, all the French irregular forces that were backing him up left. That left him standing alone, and he couldn't do it. As his army shrank, the rebel forces grew. Eventually, he was captured and he was killed. And because I already know I'm over time, one of the conclusion is that both emperors were created as a way to unite all the different factions of Mexico. Rather than being a true monarchy, they were formed as a constitutional monarchy. The reality in both cases were the divisions were too strong, and the temptation by both emperors to have more autonomy proved to be too powerful. Both were born out of revolution, and both monarchies were ended by revolution. But it was during these revolutions that Mexico gained its own identity and gained the desire to be seen as equal under their own terms. The very powers that placed them both into authority were the same ones that took them out. The problems were not the emperors. It was the corruption of power of the politicians and the division of factions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Moving along, we have now Andrew Hakes, and the title of his paper is The National Reorganization Process, Argentina's Past in the Dictatorship Era.
Argentina's past. Oh, you said cast.
Oh, oh, Argentina's past in the dictatorship era.
Seems like every year they put me after a really good presentation. Like the first year I was after Cody and he had this PowerPoint that like blew me out of the water. Like she's all like, ah, and I'm just like, how do I even word this paper? It's like, I oversimplified it tremendously. There's no Argentines here, right? Because they might get a little bit angry at me for my oversimplification. So my paper was over the national reorganization process in Argentina, which for those of you who don't know much about Argentina, which is probably the majority of you, there was a giant social engineering process overtaken during the dictatorship in the 70s and 80s to kind of restructure society to mold into the military's image and to kind of go back to the traditional ways. If you remember Heather's paper, or presentation over Spain, the traditional versus the more progressive, the ones who wanted to change society, you can kind of look at Argentina and see the same thing. For those of you who don't know where Argentina is on a map, Argentina's right here. With the most prominent city being Buenos Aires, which is where most of the trade came in, which is where most of the elites lived, which is really the area, the province of Buenos Aires that really dictated how the economy of Argentina would develop over time. So my paper is it argued that the roots of the conflict underneath the dictatorship came from Juan Perón. This isn't Juan Perón, this is a different guy. And it kind of came from the challenging the traditional order, from the institutions he set up, from using torture apparatus, for using repression apparatuses during his reign or during his time in power to kind of silence dissent. Well, at the same time, it was kind of popular because it was the masses. So as soon as this happened underneath the dictatorship and 30,000 people died, I mean, it's obviously not revered in the same light as Perón was, and it's obviously a lot more horrendous. So my paper starts at the turn of the 20th century. Emilio Mignon actually said, and he's important because his daughter died during the dictatorship. She was arrested for helping the homeless, for feeding the homeless, and apparently that's subversion in dictatorship Argentina. So he actually said that Argentina was British money, French culture, and Italian people who spoke bad Spanish. I can attest to that last part. It's really hard to understand. But I mean, this should just show you how diverse Argentina was, and actually, it should also show you how European the country is. I mean, there's a lot of Italian immigrants in Buenos Aires. There's a lot of British money in Buenos Aires. For a long period of time, the economy, the British said, you're exporting us goods, you're gonna like it, don't industrialize. The elites were like, hey, we're getting money, who cares? And I mean, remember this for the latter parts of my paper, the European aspects of Argentina. So the Constitution of 1853 said that only an educated elite got to vote in Argentina. Now this changed in 1912 because the elite of Argentina were like, you know, we want to look modern, we want to have democracy, we want to mimic the United States. They were still trying to challenge the United States for power. So they granted universal suffrage. And they thought, hey, when we hold elections in 1916, we're going to be able to, you know, subterfuge elections, kind of push our own guy into power, and they didn't. And that's actually this guy, Hipólito Yrigoyen, who won the presidency. He started doing reforms for the poor people, and the elites were like, crap, we messed up. This is terrible. And they wanted to overthrow him, but they couldn't because he was so revered by the people that if they did, well, they would have got into a massive backlash. So they waited till the Great Depression happened in the 20s, and then on September 6th of 1930, they overthrew him. The military dictatorship, who was openly fascist, not Nazi fascist, but more Mussolini fascist. And this gets me to my next guy, which is Juan Perón. So Juan Perón was a military attaché to Italy for Argentina. And in 1943, he masterminded a coup that overthrew the Argentinian government. Now you might be saying, well, I forgot to mention the elite in Argentina. Traditionally, upper echelons of the Catholic Church, upper echelons of the military, and a large landowning class that, I mean, you might know them as hacienda, people who own ranches, haciendas, these huge plantations. So you might be thinking, the military is supposed to be part of the elite. Why did they overthrow the government? Well, Perón saw the rise of Mussolini in Italy and saw industrialization tied to military strength and to power. And he saw the elite of Argentina as holding this process back. So he and a bunch of other officers in the military overthrew the government. And this is actually one of his quotes. He said, "I will do what Mussolini has done, but without the mistakes." This should also tell you where this is going. So he quickly became the head of labor. He wasn't the head of this government. He was the head of labor. And in this position, he kind of started gaining popularity with the masses of people. I mean, he was challenging the order that had been established. He was kind of giving them more reforms. And then in 1946, he won elections, which to many in the upper echelons of society, this was a huge crap. This guy, he's not our friend. He's trying to kind of reverse what we've done in society, and he did. His platform was unity, which was really just fighting what the elites had done and trying to push his own order in society, workers, of course, and anti-imperialism, which is a common theme of this panel and of the previous panels, where he was sick of the British money coming into the country that dictated how their economy would form. He was also angry at the fact that they couldn't industrialize because these central powers in Europe, the United States, didn't want Argentina to industrialize. They wanted the raw goods, they wanted the raw materials, and then they wanted to have Argentina buy them back so they could make a better profit. So under Perón's presidencies in Argentina, he created groups that targeted dissent. A lot of Argentinians really love him, so I wouldn't say this in Argentina, unless I knew what kind of crowd I was around. But he really, the pushing for unity kind of comes at the expense of people who disagree with you. So he fired judges who were not favorable to him. He actually replaced courts with people who were favorable to him, and he made these groups that kind of persuaded people to shut up and to stop talking badly about him. And he really polarized society between the traditional elite and between the masses of people. And this was because he was really the antithesis to the past 100 years of Argentinian history. He tried to industrialize. He tried to make Argentina more self-determined, but really self-determined in the fact that it was his image of what Argentina should be. So he was overthrown on September 20th, 1955. You probably saw this coming, by the military again. And this is really where my story begins. Besides the polarization, in 1957 he ordered that guerrilla groups be formed in Argentina to overthrow the government, to make a workers' revolution, which was really codenamed for "I want to come back to the country, overthrow the government, make me president again." So he orders this to happen. In 1959, guerrilla groups start functioning in Argentina on full scale. And you might be saying, well, 1959 is when the Cuban Revolution started. And they are kind of tied. Perón was a really big fan of Che Guevara. And I mean, Argentinians, depending on where you are, really big fans of Che Guevara. So guerrilla groups start functioning in 1959. And throughout the 60s and 70s, the government had a huge problem with this. I mean, they passed anti-terrorism laws. They brutally repress these people. They torture them, kill them, detain them illegally. And for a big part, people really, unless you knew somebody or unless you were on that side of politically, didn't really care. It was just one of those things, we're being terrorized, create order in society. So, where was I going with this? By 1973, it was really complex because Juan Perón actually returned in 1973, but the guerrilla groups who still fought, and they fought either for him, against him, even though they were still in his movement. His form of populism is really confusing. Latin American populism is really confusing. You'll get a headache trying to understand it. And then they also had counterinsurgency groups to target these guerrilla groups. So that should kind of set the stage of how volatile the situation was in Argentina at the time. So 1972, the year before Perón returned from exile, his choice for presidency won, and his name was Hector Campora. And what Hector Campora did was he released all the guerrillas that were in prison, that had been arrested for their terrorist actions. He abolished the anti-terrorism laws, and he actually like I said, populism is really confusing in Latin America. He favored the left-wing aspects of Perón's movement, which actually angered Perón and it angered the military of Argentina, even though typically they weren't really getting along. So Perón returns to power in 1973, and he automatically starts attacking the left wing of the movement. He says, you know, Marxism is a cancer to the country. He says, we need to get rid of these people. He actually purged them, not like Stalin purged, like he got rid of them from government positions, from university positions, from labor union positions. For labor unions, he replaced these officials with military officials. And he really started to crack down on these subversives of society. The irony here is he ordered these groups to be created for him. And then when he got back, he's like, nope, I'm done with you. Listen to me, or we're not going to have a good time with this. So he used paramilitary groups to accomplish this. But then he died in 1974. And his vice president was his wife. And he had a tendency to do this, but the problem was his wife really didn't know how to run the country. And so she really turned to the people in government who had been favorable to Perón or who had been sort of his allies. And what they recommended during this time, their economy tanked. Their economy was, the inflation rate was going up tremendously. By the time she was overthrown, it was like 900%. So they said, well, we need to get rid of these guerrilla groups. So under her the military and parts of the government actually started attacking these subversive groups, so really just the left wing of his movement, of Perón's movement. They started detaining them, torturing them, and killing them at a much smaller scale than what happened underneath these wonderful guys, but it still happened. So by 1976, March 24th of 1976, these wonderful gentlemen overthrew Isabel Perón and initiated a junta over Argentina that split the country into three branches, or three sectors that were controlled by the Air Force, the Army, and the Navy. All those wonderful gentlemen are the heads of each of those respective branches. And they really said the reason was because, well, terrorists were a huge deal in Argentina. They said, we have to stabilize the country. All right. So this was the process of national reorganization. And now these quotes are kind of actually terrible. It's absolutely ferocious. I mean, you might look at this and be like, this sounds like something Hitler would say. And, well, they liked fascism. Let's say that. So there's an author who's named Pilar Caballero who said that the armed forces assume the discipline of society in order to mold it into its image. Now, Perón was the antithesis to the elite of Argentina. This junta was the antithesis to Perón. And they wanted to restore the traditional order. They wanted to restore the place of the church, the Catholic Church in society. They wanted to fight the godless forces of communism. The United States had a big hand in the national security doctrine of pushing their ideas in Argentina. I mean, money helps. So you kind of pick up on their lingo. They wanted to eliminate class conflict through various means such as xenophobia, nationalism, and patriotism, and through education, of course. And then they wanted to eliminate these subversives and terrorists in society. But the ironic thing was at this point, most of them were already to the point of not even being able to operate successfully or even have an effect in society because the Peróns had absolutely decimated them. So Alfredo Estes, who I have here, he was actually an infamous torturer in La Esma, which is one of the torture sites they set up. And he was actually known as the Angel of Death in Argentina. Once again, the Nazi comparisons or the ties. And he was actually saying, we have to kill all of those who can't be recovered because if 2 or 3 stay alive, in a few years the whole dance will start again. Obviously, pointing at the fact that Campora had released the guerrilla prisoners and the fact that they thought Peronismo, or the Peronist movement, was this force that had created the disorder in Argentinian society, that had ruined it, that had caused this chaos. So they saw their only solution as being killing all the ones that they couldn't make to see their way of life. And this last quote is really interesting to just show you their mindset of who they were going to target, because they said it was terrorists, but it wasn't, like I mentioned before. The first leader of the junta, who was Jorge Videla, who was the guy in the middle of that last photo, said a terrorist was not just someone with a gun or a bomb, but also someone who spreads ideas that are contrary to Western civilization. So that's really ambiguous. I mean, you can't tie that down. And who gets to decide what's subversive? He does. And I mean, there's another one. They brought in people from France to actually teach them anti-terrorism, counter-guerrilla, insurgency tactics. And they really just, like the first quote said, they really just killed people and tortured them. I think 9 out of 10 people who were actually in a detention center died in Argentina. And this is actually where this is actually La Esma. It was a military school for the Navy. They got turned into a torture site in the basement while they were still doing military stuff above it. And I mean, these last 2 quotes are just kind of for you to dwell on or think about kind of the ties to Europe and the ties to these ideas. So a little bit more on who the reorganization process targeted. It was Marxists, Peronists, Jews, of course. I mean, you got to if you're a fascist. Unionists, sympathizers, and innocent people in order to isolate bases of support. Now, this idea came from the French. The French said, if you want to fight guerrillas, you have to target bases of support. They have to fear. They have to not be willing to join these people. And that was one of the main goals of the junta, of this process, was to make society fear speaking out, or fear, you know, saying they're Peronist, or fear doing these things that they consider to be contrary to Western civilization. And so I'm sure I'm out of time. I have a couple minutes still? Okay. I guess so these 2 quotes here, I guess Dr. Lucius wanted me to touch on a little bit more on the Jewish aspect of this process, but she's not here, but I already put it into my paper. So since I said that this process was really just a reversal of Peron's actions, it was a reversal of the kind of economic self-determination. It was kind of they opened up the economy to international interest. Actually, the day after the junta took power, the IMF gave millions of dollars in loan to Argentina to help rebuild the economy or whatever crap excuse they wanted to use. But where was I going with this? So with that reorganization process, they targeted Jews. I mean, a lot of these people in the military, they had fascist leanings, and it wasn't Mussolini fascist leanings, it was Hitler fascist leanings. There's a quote, actually, that the Americans taught us how to fight communism, and the Nazis taught us practical elements such as torture and killing. So this guy, Jose Moscovitz, as you can tell from the quote, he was born in Germany, he lived through the Holocaust, and then he moved to Argentina. And even though 10% of the Argentinian population was Jewish, no, 2% of the Argentinian population was Jewish, 10% of the victims of this dictatorship were Jewish. And the junta spread this huge fear throughout the military that Israel was going to come into Argentina and annex Patagonia. They were going to, you know, the anti-Semitism of fascism that says that Jews control the world, but at the same time they're so weak. So it really spread this fear throughout the military, and they did target the Jews disproportionately. They put pictures of Hitler up in their cells. They'd paint swastikas on them. They paint swastikas in their cell. They'd recite speeches while torturing them. And it was really, even though I'm kind of focusing on the Jewish aspect of it, it was really what they did to all people. They targeted you psychologically and physically. At other camps, they'd put live rats inside of people and let them eat them. And they said that this was to get people to say where their friends were in these guerrilla groups, but on the same time, they weren't in guerrilla groups. Most of these people, of the 30,000 who died, were just innocent people who were just caught up in a mess because they were helping the homeless, because they're at the head of a union, because they were doing things in society that were against this restructuring of society. So that's really the end of my paper. I mean, hopefully it made sense. Hopefully it wasn't too much of an oversimplification. And yeah.
Last but not least, we have Matthew Danielson, paper, New Directions, The Break of United States Hegemony in the Colombian Conflict.
Hi, everybody. As noted in the book, I'm a political science and English major, so talking about politics and then writing about them is kind of my thing. So this paper has multiple political elements in it. So when talking about the Colombian peace process, we actually start at the present. So about 2012 with President Santos, they began peace talks with the FARC rebels in Cuba. Now what struck out to me about the peace talks was that they were guaranteed by Cuba and by the country of Norway. So there's not a lot of snow in Cuba, so we can rule out the idea of lost Vikings. And we realize that there is greater international interest in resolving conflicts in countries like Cuba, or in Colombia. So the reality is that the conflict in Cuba or in Colombia is very complicated, and it started in 1946 through 2016, 2017, depending on how you consider it. But my paper is broken into two parts. So the first one shows how the conflict grew from an asymmetrical war, and the second part shows the possible peak and then resolutions to the conflict and responses by international organizations to participating in. So, the background of the Colombian conflict is rooted in ideological differences dating back to the colonial period, with the failure of revolutions initiated by Simón Bolívar to institute land reforms for the peasants of Gran Colombia. So in 1946, it was disagreement by elites in the cities over liberal and conservative ideology and the lack of land for the peasants that saw it become an armed conflict. It all started off with the 1948 assassination of Jorge Gaitán, the leftist mayor of Bogotá, which was the capital city of Colombia. And this became known as the period of La Violencia, or the violence, saw the deaths of an estimated 250 to 300,000 people. It didn't end until 1957 when the liberal and conservative elites came together to form the National Front. The political deal didn't sit well with fundamentalist groups on the right or the left, and this included the Colombian Communist Party, formed in the 1930s and known as the PCC. But then when the National Front proceeded to clamp down on alternate political parties on the left and the right, violence erupted again. So conflict levels varied as occasional peace deals were attempted, but after a botched military operation by the Colombian government, which was trying to capture leading figures in the PCC, peace was less frequent. It's important to note the PCC subsequently became the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or the FARC. It was predominantly a localized movement, not generally supported by outside communist organizations like the USSR. There was some aid from the regime in Cuba, which came to power in 1959, but what was mainly support in the form of advice was not necessarily heeded, because the historical setting of the conflict in Colombia from 1948 meant that the principles of the urban middle-class revolutionaries of Cuba did not mesh well with the peasant rebellion ideas of Colombia. Likewise, the Soviet Union only had interest in interacting with the revolutionaries in Cuba and not with the Colombian Marxists or really most of the other Marxist rebellions in Latin America. At the time of the military operation that sparked the move of the PCC to the FARC, the PCC was officially following the 1956 proclamation of the 20th Congress of the Communist Party, which was renouncing violence as a means of creating a communist state. Now, the PCC was already quietly conducting armed resistance, but the spectacular failure of the Colombian government's mission saw the FARC openly disregard the 1956 proclamation, and there were no reprimands from international communist movements. But this didn't encourage support from international communist movements. So the lack of coordination with outside communist groups meant resources weren't arriving except for advice, which didn't buy guns, and the lack of outside funding played into the gradual appearance of illegal drugs in the funding methods of the FARC during their conflict. The turn by the FARC to illegal drugs for money was not only based on the need of money by the FARC, but also because of the ease of profitability that the drugs offered. The basis of illegal drugs becoming profitable originated with the U.S. Harrison Narcotics Act of 1914. The bill was passed by the U.S. Congress in response to a growing fear that the freely available substances of heroin and cocaine were creating a national health hazard. After the ban, demand for the drugs fell sharply, and by 1917, demand for cocaine was low enough that most of the South American producers were put out of business. The cocaine producers were further hurt by a continued global interdiction through sanctions from the League of Nations, which were targeted mainly at the beginning of World War II in an effort to hinder the other main consumers of cocaine, Germany and Japan. But near the end of World War II, demand in the U.S. for cocaine rose again, and Peru and Bolivia saw their production skyrocket. So the U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency arrested their first drug smuggler with cocaine in 1939, but they didn't face major imports to the U.S. until the late 1940s. The rise of cocaine production in the late 1940s and early 50s coincided with the rise of unfavorable political parties in Latin America. Efforts were made to curb movements seen as sympathetic to communism, like the Aprista political party in Peru and Bolivia. And as coca producers were alleged to have contributed money to said movements, the United States, the United Nations, and other allies moved to declare the production of cocaine as illegal, as it was seen as funding these movements. Western sympathetic governments in Peru and Bolivia made similar declarations, and the cocaine industry was driven to Cuba and Chile. Cuba, naturally, was the 1940s and 50s vice capital of Latin America. And Chile, because of its proximity to the Andean coca growing fields and from having a government that was unsympathetic to the U.S. policies. 1959 disaster struck for Cuba, in that communist revolutionaries overthrew the government, and there was an exodus of many of the Cubans who had run the cocaine industries. So they had to find a new home. This brought an end to Cuba and made Chile the main producer. This lasted until the rise of the US-backed Pinochet regime in 1973. And the logical and proximal move for the drug industry was then to the Andean country of Colombia. Here in southern Colombia, which is already out from under control of the Colombian government because of the conflict with the FARC, the industry thrived. And while the FARC initially outlawed production of coca, the plight of unemployed peasant farmers and the attraction of easy income overcame beliefs that the coca industry was the ideological vice of the wealthy elites, and thus production, while being taxed, was permitted. The newfound wealth in the industry of the illegal drugs in the period of 1970-1975 also saw the rise of other people wanting to cash in, mainly narco barons. So you had people like Benjamin Reina, Alberto Bravo, and especially Pablo Escobar. They used their financial and popular support from their illegal drug enterprises to become involved in Colombian politics. The rush to power saw Escobar elected to National Congress in 1982, and soon most of the cartel owners were wealthy landowners. The emergence of a new elite disturbed the FARC, and they began targeting the narco barons specifically by kidnapping of the families, the cartel owners, and in general having drug turf wars. The cartels formed militias to protect themselves and their holdings, and more violence erupted. The Colombian government fought all the participants in this to varying degrees of success. The presence of Escobar as an elected official was unpalatable to the U.S. and to many Colombian government officials. So in 1948, Colombian Justice Minister Lara Bonilla ousted Escobar and other cartel members from politics. This action, along with demands by the U.S. for the extradition of Pablo Escobar to the United States, had the drug smugglers and other producers of drugs declare war on the Colombian government, and Colombia became the murder capital of the world. Escobar's death in 1993 at the hands of Colombian security forces and the subsequent decapitation of the other leadership in the cartels led to disarray in the militias. This did not lessen the drug trade, but it did provide an opportunity for the FARC, who gained military strength from the experiences in fighting the drug cartels, and it also provided territory for them to tax production of drugs. So by 1996, the FARC was on the verge of conquering the government of Colombia and owning the entire trade. So the former militias of the cartels united to create the Autodefensas Unidas de Colombia, or the AUC, to try and regain their shares of the coca market. This war was successful in the sense that it checked the advances of the FARC, but the total war waged by the AUC saw the levels of violence grow catastrophic, attracting international attention. And this is where we move into the second part, where international organizations then get interested again once more in Colombia. So the lack of participation in international bodies ends here because of the increase of violence and because institutions globally were more mature and able to take action. So we're talking about in the top right-hand corner, you see the flag of the European Union. The top left is the United Nations. Bottom left is NATO, and the bottom right is the Soviet Union. U.S. policy had been dominant in Colombia, and it was to support the government. So the ideas behind the 1999 Clinton administration's Plan Colombia was different. The goal was to create a massive aid package to help Colombia stem the violence once and for all, including the elimination of coca production. However, the program was perceived by international bodies like the EU as mostly military aid, point argued by the US, but the end result was the EU did not participate. Until the early 2000s, the European Union had been conducting alternate development programs only in Bolivia due to the violence in countries of Colombia and Peru, and because the EU does not actually have a standing army except in case of Article 42, where an attack on the EU would respond with a military force there. So they don't have an interventionist, per se, army ready to go. So at the time of the Clinton administration's Plan Colombia, EU was in the process of expanding alternate programs, but from a business perspective first. And we see evidence of this with increased levels of business cooperation, like trade increases and tariff reductions, which rose in the period of 1980 and 85 to 1995 to 2000. The overall levels of cooperation between Latin America and Europe were relatively low, with less than 10% of trade being between the two countries, or the region of the EU and the country of Colombia. But it was a foreshadow of the explosion in cooperation that would happen in the late 2000s. There were several factors also driving closer ties between the EU and Colombia, and one was the increase in cocaine smuggling to Europe, and another was the failure of the negotiations by the Andean Regional Plan, which was sort of a mini EU but in Latin America, which made Colombia the go-to country for investment by most of Europe. The greatest increase in the EU and Colombia relationship came from the decrease in US policy preference in Latin America, evidenced by the loss of US dominance in the Organization of American States. You see their flag there, the OAS. Such is not displayed by actions taken by the OAS, but by the lack of action taken until the late 2000s. The arm of the OAS that provided an open forum on drugs was not created until the 1986 formulation of the Inter-American Drug Abuse Control Commission. Likewise, despite Colombian involvement involving drugs since led to late 1970s, the OAS's hemispheric plan on action on drugs was not created in 2011. The plan was adopted at the Sixth Summit of the Americas in 2013, so we see the time lag between drugs becoming involved and then action being taken by as a collective. So the documentation analyzed situation in Americas that was published at the 2013 Congress and offered policies about what solutions to use, including some ideas that treated the drug issue as more social than one solved through security. This indicated a shift in thinking by member states from the security mindset predominantly of the US to independent Latin American ideas. So what we can conclude then is that the involvement of international organizations in Colombia and Latin America is growing while the influence of the United States is shrinking. The loss of hegemony by the United States is evidence both of success and failure by US policies. Failure in maintaining the forefront of policy initiatives, success in that many countries now choose their own policies from internal decisions. Prior to today, action by organizations like the EU and the OAS was not even possible due to such issues as no standing army. Organizations like the EU were unable to operate in Colombia and other volatile regions because of the high levels of violence. The presence of a European nation at the peace talks in Cuba demonstrates how Latin American countries now feel secure enough to entertain new voices in their dialogue. The movement of the OAS to consider ideas that reflect new policy perspectives also indicates the body has decided to continue what they started decades ago with the lessening of tensions with Cuba. Fear of policy domination by the US is also at work, creating a solidarity between Latin American countries, especially as poverty and other economic ills have not seen major improvement in the region. Intervention by the US in Colombia is not without precedent or procedure, as demonstrated with Guatemala, Nicaragua, Chile, and more. What is different about the Colombian example is the gradual movement of Colombia in accepting alternate entities in the peace process. A decline in US dominance of policy is present despite the lack of a military defeat by the Colombian government. While US policy in Colombia reflects a shift in accepted ideology for the region, the end result is that the Colombian people are now free to choose from a wide array of economic and social possibilities. So, thank you.
Thank you for those 4 really interesting papers. Questions, comments?
My question is primarily for Rosie, but it can be applied to the entire panel. And I want to preface it by saying that back in the Stone Ages, before the internet, when my generation was going to do a research paper, we were very limited in what we had for actual data and historical records. So we trudged down to the local library, we foraged through stacks of books, and we took the information we got from it pretty much as the gospel. And we've learned that 99% of history is all written word, and it can be, depending on who's writing it, can be slanted, to maybe change the outcome or how we want history to be perceived. Now, when your generation's doing papers in this new information age where you can sit down with a tablet or even your phone and literally have access to the entire wealth of information that's available to humanity, you see in this last election we just had where everything that, in my generation, when we did research, we took everything we found as this is how it was. Now, we've seen in this last election how we're fed by the media information, and it can be, depending on who's presenting it, slanted or biased, or you hear the terms like spin thrown around on different types of information. My question is, and you spoke of this in your notes, that you cross-referenced all of your information and you found a lot of contradictions, sometimes even in the same documents. How much thought did you as a panel, and we even saw it in the first panel, how much thought went into, as I'm doing my research on this, how much of this information may be slanted or biased towards, okay, we want a certain outcome to be presented as this event?
I think that's a beautiful question. Why don't we let the panel respond?
Well, I should preface, I was looking for bias. I was looking for slants and contradictions because my whole paper was how the English interpretation of Indian culture and society was a contradiction to itself. So I was actively searching for those things. I generally found less contradictions in terms of like secondary sources and historians speaking about these events. Because most of the contradictions I ended up finding were in the primary sources. It was the imperialists and the Orientalists in the same document saying things like, you know, the Muslims are bloodthirsty monsters. 5 paragraphs later, the Muslims are respectable warriors, stuff like that. So, you know, I'm not quite sure the situation was quite the same for me, but maybe someone else can.
Yeah, for me, when I was looking for, I'm a political science major, so what I tried to do is I tried to find more of a political slant to it. And what I found when I was doing my research, and I looked around all sorts of different books, I tried to find something that held the politics of it, but it was very, very difficult for me to find that. I saw a lot of personal accounts of they were there, but like you said, there is a certain slant to it. But we have to also say, along with that slant, we have to take some of it with a grain of salt. But it is an opinion, and when it's collaborated through different sources, that's when it starts becoming a little bit more factual.
Jeez. I mean, mine's complicated. I tried to use, I think I even put it in the works I tried to look at. The United States government still holds the files of the people who were disappeared underneath the Argentine dictatorship. That's why, I don't know if you guys watch the news a lot, but when Obama visited Argentina, there was a huge uproar because the day he picked was their day of remembrance for the dictatorship. And they were like, you still have the documents of like who died and how many died, give a. So, I mean, the biggest contradictions I find are people in the States a lot more call it a dirty war. They actually say that the military was fighting guerrillas, and people in Argentina say, no, I mean, most of the guerrillas were gone. They were really just trying to restructure society. Or, you know, a lot of U.S. sources say 10,000 died, and a lot of Argentinians are like, in 1979, 4 years before the dictatorship ended, the military said, we've killed 22,000. Chile, they said that to Pinochet, and they also told the Catholic Church in like 78, we've killed 15,000. So a lot of, I found a lot of contradictions, but to kind of try to remedy that, I tried to get sources outside of the United States. I tried to get sources from Argentina, sources from Europe, sources from people who didn't really have the ties to the political stance and to just the political, I can't say the word I want to use, but nonsense of the situation.
I have to say for my paper it was almost easy to find different sources because it was a very ideological war and in developing, so you have Marxists on one side and non-Marxists on the other side. So there's one scholar by the name of Peter Gutenberg, and he's written a number of papers on the movement of cocaine and all the facets of the trade itself. And he lines more ideologically leaning towards the left, and then you can find other sources that will refute Gutenberg, and you can assume they're leaning more towards the right. So in a way, they're checking themselves in the way that they're having a conversation in their academics.
Yes.
Sorry, I'll be brief. I'll try to. Okay, so my question's for Rosie. First of all, thanks for bringing attention to this part of the world, because it's often underrepresented, even though it's the second largest population in the world. But I'm interested in India economics and that to its neighbor to the northeast, China. So I know for much of world history, India and China have had the largest global share of GDP. And it wasn't until the 1800s where European countries started to pass them And of course, a lot of that was to do with imperialism and kind of putting down of India and China. And then so now a lot of scholars are saying we're starting to see a turn back to the way things were with India and China having larger GDPs. And so China is playing its part in that, as it now has, according to many economists, the second largest GDP in the world, with some saying even the largest, surpassing the US, but that's kind of disputed because it's hard to get accurate figures out of China. But India is still way behind China, although it's still, I mean, it's growing rapidly, but it's still pretty far back. So a lot of scholars claim that the reason for this is because India was completely taken over by colonists, but China was not. So, I mean, do you think there's anything to that assessment?
I didn't do any specific research on that, so all I can make are educated guesses and assumptions. But I would not be surprised if colonialism was somehow involved. I mean, the East India Company became the government of India purely because they had monopoly on pretty much everything. So I wouldn't be surprised that having that kind of economic agency having been taken away from them for several years, it would be difficult for Native Indians to get back into that kind of producing a high GDP and stuff like that. I think it's also possible that people remember the Indian independence as being a peaceful thing with the Gandhi's movements and stuff, but it often gets left out that that there were a lot of internal issues. The split of India and Pakistan wasn't very clear, so there was probably a lot of issues left unresolved within India at the time independence came about, which also kind of impeded its economic growth. So I hesitate to say definitely, but I would not be surprised.
Okay. Interesting.
Heather?
Hi, Andrew, I need to bother you now. Sorry, considering you mentioned some of the political polarization that's occurring in Argentina and the fact that you happened to visit there, I know, for one of your studies.
Yeah.
And because you mentioned my presentation, I will get back at you now. Do you find that there's a similar form of memory politics going on in Argentina after this conflict, where the two sides are having trouble kind of coming together into one specific?
It's really complicated. I'll try to keep that really simple. After it, they had the policy of hush up for a couple of years, and then they tried some of the higher ups, and it worked for a while. Then they had some back and forth where they let him out of jail, put him back in jail. So 2004, they put a lot of the higher ups in jail. Jorge Videla was already in jail for a long time by this point, but Nestor Kirchner actually started a process to kind of open up not the memory, but really to open up what happened and try to try people. So I think the biggest fight was, how to transition to democracy peacefully, how to deal with it when half of your police officers were involved in torturing and killing people. And then I would say before now, there wasn't really a consensus of, some people might have believed the dictatorship did a good thing, but it was kind of like, you didn't say that in public. But now, the president of Argentina actually said, to us it's not a big deal, but he said, to the 9,000 who died, but I can't verify numbers, but he said 9,000, and to most Argentinians, it's over 22,000, it's 30,000, it's around that number. So to them, that's kind of like the denial aspect that you'd only hear on like the really far fringes of the right, and he's kind of bringing that up. And this is at the same time when he's saying, I want to build a wall between Bolivia and Argentina. So he's kind of hitting all these nationalist sentiments that target the elements of society. So it's complicated. It depends what kind of memory you're looking for politics up until after the late 90s up until now. You didn't really hear that denial aspect or the dictatorship was good aspect, but now it's interesting.
For the Mexico paper, what is the current view of Santa Ana? I mean, Simón Bolívar's George Washington, South America. What is Santa Ana now?
All of these people that I mentioned in here, and this was like a really long paper, and I glossed over so much stuff on there. He's considered a hero. He is still considered a hero. All these people in this paper are considered a hero, with the exception of Maximilian, the second emperor, and Augustine, the first emperor. And but at this point, Mexico he's a hero. You know, what's interesting about him is that during all of his battles, he had his leg amputated, and he had this grand funeral for his leg, and he had it shipped over. It was buried, and it was this wonderful thing. And when he fell out of favor, they dug up his leg while he was still alive. They dug up his leg. They paraded it through the towns. So he was actually like one of the few people whose leg has been more places than his body has.
I'm going to give you, like, particularly to panelists about Latin America, my perspective as a Latino. For us in Latin America, it's very clear that for years, the American influence has been pretty much this fight, this proxy war between the Soviet Union, the Marxist ideas, and then capitalistic ideas, and those two ideas conflicted in countries where American interests are. Like the reason why not in Cuba is basically because Cuba doesn't have oil, but Colombia does, Mexico does, and all those countries. But when I listened to your presentations, I got this perspective of a very pale, like American influence was not there. Like, you know, like when you say, I got the idea that it's like people in Argentina fighting two sides instead of saying, wait a minute, this is the CIA controlling the Argentinian government, doing this, and this persecution against people with any kind of ideas pro-union, for example, or laborers. And same thing in Colombia. This description of different events in Colombia without saying, wait a minute, this is something like all this process has had the manipulation of Washington behind, and this fear of, you know, like Marxist ideas taking over those countries, the way it has happened in Bolivia, for example, or countries where they have gone like, and the result of the process is that for years, I remember when I was in college, we began talking about, why are we Colombians stupid or what? Why are we fighting each other and killing each other so that Americans are happy and the Soviets are happy? When are we gonna stop? Finally, we have a president who agrees with that, and he's like, okay, we had Uribe before Santos, and Uribe was the guy going with the army, going with the American support for 8 years, killing people, trying to eradicate anyone who would have any kind of relation to the guerrilla. And now we have a president who was the minister of the army at that time. And now he's just like, you know what, let's try another strategy. Let's go to Europe. Let's get the support of Europe, and let's see if we can do something here, and we can have a different approach. My question related to the same question that you had regarding sources, why is it like that? Is it that people who write, they tell a different story, or was it that all the sources that you found didn't want us to mention that part? What about the American? What about the American?
Actually, a big part of my paper that I had to cut out because I wanted to just mention the process of what happened was the opening up the Argentine economy for the U.S. influence. I mean, the biggest part was in '77, Henry Kissinger was talking to one of the ministers of Argentina, and he's like, you need to get what you're doing done by the end of the year. Referencing the killings, he's like, it's basically the shock doctrine of, I forget the guy's name now, Milton Friedman, the shock doctrine. And it really applied to Chile and Argentina to kind of restructure these economies during a crisis, the terrorist in Argentina. And I mean, the most interesting thing I found was when the Argentine dictatorship ended in 1983, all the loans they took internationally from the US, from the IMF, from all these international organizations, they nationalized the debt so the people had to pay it off. So I mean, a large part of my paper was critiquing US, and a lot of in the United States, it really was, most people kind of link to the dirty war aspect, or they don't talk about it, but the Argentine sources I had definitely brought up the fact that they thought the dictatorship not only was to reverse the gains of Perón, but I mean, one of Perón's gains was to get the United States and foreign interests out of the country so they could actually do their own thing. And did that help? Did that answer it at all? A little bit.
I'm more concerned about sources.
Well, yeah.
Do they leave it out?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
I
mean, no one.
Well, I think your paper addressed the declining power of the United States.
Yeah. One of my
Matthew, excuse me.
Sorry, no. One of my issues with finding materials is that a lot of papers are in Spanish, and my Spanish is rudimentary at best. So I had to go with sources that were in English. And but I guess I was getting at, in my title, it is the breakup of U.S. power and dominance here, and it's the fact that the U.S. has been dictating most of the policy that's been going on. We see not until 2013 that the OAS starts putting forward ideas about drug treatment that aren't security solutions. And we see the introduction of the European nations or of countries that aren't the US then participating in peace process and stuff. So I didn't get into the specifics on like the presidents of Colombia, like Álvaro Uribe and President Santos, and their disagreements with each other over like the peace process. We saw with the referendum recently. But it is a declining U.S. ideology driving policy for the hemisphere in general.
So just to add on that, that's a big thing in Argentina too. I'm sure you heard me say godless communism. I mean, for those who know about the national security doctrine, that was a big thing. You know, the West in religion versus the East, you know, Soviet Union. So I mean, a lot of the terms they used in Argentina did come from the national security doctrine, and I think on this, the elite in Argentina knew when to play on these words. Like they knew when to say, oh, the communists are trying to take over, even though the populace killed or targeted communists just as much as this government did. But they knew to say, oh, the commies are trying to take over a government, so then the U.S. would give aid, they would give military support, they'd give CIA training. The most interesting thing was Argentina rubbed the U.S.'s back and sent troops to Nicaragua to help fight the Sandinistas. But then when it came to Malvinas, the U.S. was like, we're not touching Britain. Are you stupid? And then that's when the dictatorship kind of lost their sway over society. But yeah, I definitely think there is a difference between sources from the U.S. versus outside of the U.S., especially when it comes to something that the U.S. was involved in that we like to say, oh, we didn't do that. How dare you say that?
Other questions? Maybe it's time for lunch.
Yeah.
Thanks for